The videos I made last week about wealth tax caused a bit of a stir in some of the comments sections. Clearly there's a lot of negative reaction to the idea of a wealth tax, even though only about 25,000 people would actually pay that tax. So I have to conclude that either a lot of those 25,000 people are watching my videos, or that there's some sort of underlying resistance to the idea of any additional taxation. And that's beside the fact that the wealth tax itself, as we saw in the image here, is a pretty small section of the total. And so some people might say, well, that's not very much anyway, not worth having. And other people would say, well, actually, you can do a lot with that sort of sum of money. It's 24 billion, you can do a lot with that. And we saw that you could do a lot. You could fix all the potholes on the road, for example. You could get rid of tuition fees for university students completely. You could provide free dental health for everybody, and there'd be loads of change left over after you've done that. So that 24 billion, pretty big sum, can do some pretty good things that you'd think would be pretty popular. And yet there's a lot of negativity about the idea of any sort of additional taxation, even from people who will never pay it. And that's always been the case. So I thought I would look in this video at something at the other end of the scale, which is what is the most money the government spends? Where does most of our tax go? And this image sort of answers the question, because we think of it as a sort of washing machine. The big box around the outside, the yellow bit, that is the total of government spending, which is about 1.3 trillion, 1,300 billion, if it's easier to think of in those terms. And here in the middle, in the washing machine, in the drum, if you like, we've got various aspects of financing for pensions. And the blue bit at the bottom, well, that is the state pension, the basic state pension, which goes to about 12 million people. And that's about 155 billion pounds. And then above that, we've got the sort of pensions that get paid to former state employees. So that would be people in the health service, teachers, judges, policemen, civil servants, that sort of thing. So there's a good 50 billion or so being paid to them in their pensions, which is in addition, of course, to the state pension they receive. And then above that, we've got tax credits. Now, that's a bit of an odd one. That's where the government effectively doesn't charge tax on people's pension contributions. So effectively, it's a contribution by the government towards the money that we save for our pensions. And that's another 50 billion to 60 billion. It's a pretty big sum. And finally, at the top, we've got incapacity benefit. Now, what's incapacity benefit doing in here? Well, it's paid to people who are not of pensionable age, but people who are not healthy enough to work. So it's a sort of pension for people who are not entitled to a pension, if you like, but who still need it. And we'll talk about that later in the context of this image here, which explains a bit about that. So that's a scenario, that's what the image shows. And obviously it's a huge sum. It's nearly a quarter of the total of government spending, and it's getting bigger all the time, to be honest. Every year it gets bigger. The government's got this triple lock, which means that pensions tend to rise more than anything else. So it's never going to get any less. It's going to get more and more, and that means that more and more of the tax we pay has to go towards it. And that seems to be a situation that it's just going to get worse and worse, and there's no way out of that, if you like. I mean, this is the reality of the situation, and when you add to that a similar image that we could do for the health service or for the education service, where the amount of money the government has to spend just goes up and up, then it's not surprising that it's trying to sort of chip away at spending in all sorts of other areas, what it calls discretionary spending, and why our roads are indeed full of holes and potholes, and why the government's trying to squeeze students to pay more and more for their education, and why the dental service is in such a poor state, and why the courts have got years and years and years of delay, and all the rest of it, all those things that don't work because the government has to fund these massive great forms of expenditure. So what's going on? What's going to happen? What is the end game with all of this? Well, it's a good question, because fundamentally there's two things going on. One is that the UK economy is not producing enough. Simply not producing enough real wealth. And what's interesting is that actually these people, these retired people, they do produce quite a lot of real wealth, because they're doing things like looking after their grandchildren. They're doing things like growing vegetables in their garden. They're volunteering in all sorts of ways that are really useful. They're doing all sorts of unpaid work, which is really valuable. Because as we said before, quite often unpaid work is more valuable than paid work. It's more useful. It's work that really, really needs to be done. And these retired people often are doing that. So they are actually doing quite a lot of useful work, but in the entirety of the economy, we're not doing enough, productive work. Too much of what we do in the economy is transactional. It's passing money from pillar to post, from one person to another, and it's accumulating in the hands of the extremely rich. Now that's the problem, because that takes us back to the wealth tax. Because once that money is accumulated, it's extraordinarily hard to get back. And the accumulation of that money creates another problem, which is that these people, and indeed all the rest of us, have to pay more for our accommodation, for our housing. We have to pay more for our energy, for our water. We have to pay more for pretty much everything, because the economy is structured in such a way as to extract as much money as possible from us. And if we keep having money extracted from us, then when the government is going to provide things like pensions, it's got to give us more to compensate for that. I mean, it's pretty logical that if the cost of living is going up because of the way the economy is structured, because more and more money is being extracted and put into the hands of wealthy investors, then the government is going to have to subsidise people more to pay for that. So that's what's going on, and fundamentally we're not going to get out of the situation by taxing more. The wealth tax is not really a tax. The wealth tax has to be a sort of smash and grab rape, if you like, on the accumulated wealth of a relatively small section of the economy where the money is just getting greater and greater. And that's only going to happen not through a policy of taxation, but through a restructuring of the economy so that that money doesn't accumulate in those ways. And that requires a whole range of different policies that we've talked about housing, about banking, about industry, and all sorts of other things that we can't go into now. So really this isn't about tax, that's the point. This is really about the structure of the economy. And tax is like a sort of sticking plaster the government keeps trying to sort of use to patch things up. And it's ultimately all going to collapse, because the amount of tax that's required to sustain this sort of thing is just not achievable. You can't keep taking their money away from people to give it back to them. It's just pointless. You've got to create more real wealth in the economy so that people don't need so much support, because they can create wealth for themselves. It's a structural problem, and it's built in. And if we don't change the structure, we're not going to solve it. And just as an example of that, go back to this illustration here that I talked about. Now this is relevant to the whole question of incapacity benefit, because what we've got here is the life expectancy. In blue, the life expectancy of your typical person, which is sort of vaguely 80 years or so for both men and women, a bit more for women than men. And what we've got in yellow through the middle there is an indication of the retirement age. So this is the retirement age, which is currently 66. It's going to go up to 67 at some point in the future, but currently it's 66. And what we've got with these red lines here, this pattern imposed onto the blue background, is the period of people's life on average in which they're not healthy. So this is the healthy life expectancy. It's up to this point, and this is the point at which health deteriorates and people are not able to, for example, work. So what we're seeing is that the healthy life expectancy on average for people, both men and women, is about 60 years old. And that average covers a wide range, of course, because some people will be fine till they're 70, others may get ill when they're about 50. But on average, it's about 60. And the retirement age is 66. So fundamentally, we've got a population that can't work on average beyond the age of 60 with a retirement age of 66, and that's not sustainable either. And the incapacity benefit up here, well, that's sort of filling the gap. That's this pension that we pay to people who are not well enough to work, but they haven't reached their retirement age. And what this points to is another failure of the economy, because, of course, we've seen with other images that the situation is very, very unequal, that some people will do fine until they're 70 or more, and others will become ill in their late 40s or early 50s, and that very much reflects the wealth background from which they come. People from the poorer parts of the country, on the whole, become ill much, much earlier in life than people from wealthier parts of the country. And that's another structural failing. It's the way in which the economy is simply not working to support people in their needs. So there we are, two new images to illustrate what's going on in the UK economy with all its terrible problems that we're not going to solve unless we begin to take them much more seriously than we are. It's not going to work to sort of tinker around the edges. And all of this project here at Bonkers Economics is designed to point out that the fundamental assumptions around the economy are not working, that the way in which the thing is structured is not working, that the consequences of it are that we gradually get poorer and poorer over a long period of time because we're not producing the wealth for ourselves that we need to sustain a good quality of life.